Well, it seems like since Theros Beyond Death has dropped, everybody's got some version of the blue self mill deck. And it's kind of sweet, so I guess it's my turn. So I'm going to share one with you too. Okay, now I'll be open and honest here. I started working on this list, and then it turns out the guys over at Arena Deck List actually had something kind of similar. So if I I guess I'm going to give a little bit of credit here to Brian Gottlieb over there because he had one or two cards that kind of got my mind going a little bit. My list has a couple that his doesn't have, but I would like to say that his is very much the inspiration for this. But the thing I like about the version I want to play is that it gives you a way out to actually attack and win and isn't solely stuck on having to mill yourself out. I think the issue we run into a lot of times watching these decks play is that though they can win through the self mill plan, they have no other plan once that goes sideways. Or if one of their key cards gets countered, they sort of get stuck. And that's not really where you want to be with your deck because if it's all or nothing, you end up really feeling bad if your cards don't come together. So anyway, let's go down the list. We've got some Merfolk Secret Keepers. You've got the new card, Thassa's Oracle, which is really the card that's got everybody excited. This card does two things. In the early part of the game, it actually lets you look at the top few cards of your deck, based on whatever your devotion to blue is. But then you get to actually, it's like Super Scry. You get a couple cards out of the deal, and then you just mill the rest. And then if you happen to not have any cards left in your deck, then you win the game. So you can use it early to filter through, find a couple of things, chunk some lands you don't want. Then you use it late, hopefully, when you're looking at 10 or 15 even potential cards to get you where you want to go. Then you follow it up with Well of Lost Thoughts, which is another way just to mill stuff. And then Drowned Secrets, which you mill something every time you play a blue card. Now, those are basically all the tools you're going to have to get stuff into your graveyard. Granted, there is a Jace over here in the list, obviously. It's a great card, but you're not really relying on Jace to win. Jace is almost an additional win condition. So now you have a copy of Jace and you have the Thassa's Oracle. This whole middle column, really, if you want to call it that, the way the deck breaks down, these are all the cards that actually keep your opponent's threats off of you. So Brazen Bower lets you bounce any permanent, really, that's a non-land. So that can slow your opponent down, buy you a couple turns. It also counts as casting a spell, so that's going to trigger, Drowned Secrets. But then at the same time, it also can be a creature of your own. So you can block flyers, which several decks are starting to pack now. You can also just go on the beatdown plan, especially with our next card, Gadwick. So your whole deck is blue effectively, except for the Nyx Lotus. So every card you play is basically going to trigger Gadwick to be able to tap an opponent's creature. So if you end up in a situation where you have a couple of Brazen Bower and a Gadwick, you can just attack and win over the course of 3 turns. And that's not that difficult to do. Kiora is in the list kind of doing two things. Like, she's not really in here for her static ability to draw extra cards, because the only thing that could potentially draw you a card is going to be the Thassa that we'll talk about here in a second. Otherwise, she's really here for fast mana and for letting you get extra uses out of your Nyx Lotus. And then Arcanist out, you're seeing this a lot in decks that also play Thassa. And part of that is just simply the devotion to blue that it gives you is huge. Like that and Thassa alone give you an activated Thassa. And she's not to be underrated. She's a 6/5 creature for 4 mana. The cool part about Thassa, though, is that at the beginning of each end step, you can remove a creature from play and return it to play. This is huge in this deck when you're talking about stuff like Thassa's Oracle that can be used again, something like Well of Lost Thoughts that can be used again. Like, you can get this mill plan really going really fast. So you can knock once Thassa is active, you can start knocking cards into your graveyard 6 and 8 in a time on a turn sometimes, if not more. I mean, think about the situations where you're going to have an Arcanist Owl, a Thassa, and then Thassa's Oracle. I mean, that alone is already what, 4, 5, 6, 7. So each time you do that at the end of a turn, that's 7 cards you're getting to look at with the Thassa's Oracle. And that's big time. I mean, that's going to take you no time to get there. Now, the interesting thing is, this also gives you another way to stall the game with Flood of Tears. Flood of Tears returns everything, or all non-land permanents, to players' hands. And then if you return more than 4 token or cards, you actually get to return a card from your hand to play. So there's a lot going on with this card. But the really, really, really cool thing about it is you actually get to kind of change the momentum of the game, if you want to call it that. Like, once you've built up extra mana, say with like a Nyx Lotus, and you have that turn where maybe you tap the Lotus, you tap your other mana, use Cure to untap the Lotus, you tap the Lotus again, you play Flood of Tears, now you put something back into play, possibly the Lotus, and then you just start going off. And it's really, really hard for your opponents to stop you from milling yourself out at that point and aiming for the end of the game. So this is a version I really, really like. You know, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a top tier deck, though it could be. I haven't played it enough to really get into the intricacies of the plays to make that declaration. But overall, I would really enjoy this deck. I would say the issues it's going to have, more likely than not, are decks that have a lot of what we call permanent removal, not just for creatures, but if they're playing a pile, and this would most likely be, say, like a Selesnya or a mono white enchantment based deck. If they're playing several Banishing Lights and Conclave Tribunals, you know, that sort of thing, if it's able to get rid of your Thassa or even your Gadwick, it can make it hard for you to stop some of their flyers coming over, doing any of the tricky things you want to do, and slow things down quite a bit. But I mean, maybe the really big hitter Gruul decks, because your O4s can only do so much to block those. But most other creature decks are probably going to be pretty good against. I would caution against probably the real heavy control decks, because you don't have a lot of cards they really have to worry about. I mean, your creatures are okay when you get them, but they're not really threatening. So a lot of those are going to get to slide by. But when you get into the near winning condition situations toward the end of the game, it can be harder to resolve the spell you want. And in all reality, depending on how they're trying to win, you may not have much to do against their side either. So that's something to consider if you were to play this. Maybe some sideboard cards for some of the higher casting costs spells for something like Fires of Invention decks, or maybe just go in to just more negates and try to win those fights. But in general, a lot of the creature decks you should probably be able to hold up against, just as long as you mulligan aggressively, I would say. I know it's something that doesn't get talked a lot about with decks, but this is one where you could very easily end up in a weird situation, because Nyx Lotus is 4, Flood of Tears is 6, Thassa is 4, Arcana Sal is 4, Gadwick is technically 4 plus. You know, so if your hand has 3 of those in it and maybe one small thing and some lands, it's not necessarily going to be the most productive hand. So you're really going to be looking for stuff that lets you get some of those cards milled into your yard early. So you'll want 2 or 3 of your early creatures or cards that you can play on the first 3 turns, then maybe one of your bigger ones and some lands. Like, that's more of your ideal hand. So if you don't have that, feel free to mulligan, get to where you can for sure play 2 or 3 spells in the early turns. Because also, your creatures are serving as damage prevention. So if you can get them to stick for a turn or two, that's going to give you a little bit of leeway to get to those later stage turns. If you don't have a way to block or slow down your opponent's damage, you're just going to be wrecked from the get-go. So don't be afraid to mulligan a hand just because, you know, you have an Arcana Sal, or just because you got the Nyx Lotus. Like, yes, you want those cards for the later part of the game, but that's fine. We can draw more. You're playing multiples of them. Don't put yourself in a situation where those cards, well, one, you'd have to get a little bit lucky, but 2, those cards 100% have to make the difference in that game, or you would end up losing. Because more often than not, that's probably going to come back to bite you, and that's not what you're looking for. But this is a cool deck. If you want something different, you don't want to play just the standard control decks or just the everyday beatdown decks or whatever, like, this is a very cool change of pace. I would recommend this. I'm not a blue player, but this is the type of blue deck I can enjoy because your cards are doing more than just countering spells. Like, you're bouncing things, you're turning cards into your yard, you're returning stuff to your hand to do other stuff, and then your win condition can totally get by if the board's gummed up. So all around, this is pretty cool. This has motivated me to play some blue decks where I wouldn't before. So good job to Wizards and R&D. This is a fun mix of cards. I would like to see this deck be really competitive and maybe even run into it more often at FNMs and stuff. But yeah, this is cool. I say give it a chance. The other cool part about this deck is it's not loaded with real expensive cards. I mean, Thassa is a little pricey right now, but otherwise, and I guess maybe Nyx Lotus, but Gadwig's not expensive. Brazen Bar was expensive. It's starting to come down a bit. Jace obviously isn't. Flooded Tears isn't. And the majority of your deck is commons and uncommons. So all around, this is really cool. I guess I didn't touch on the land, so I needed that. But realistically, it's just 4 Castle Vantress and a bunch of islands because you're just playing blue cards and no reason to get tricky. So I'm not really hiding anything there. But otherwise, yeah, give this deck a look. If you like playing this strategy, now is your time. This is probably the best that it's been in a while. And it's cool that it actually doesn't shoehorn you just into one way of winning. This gives you a different outlet as well. So overall, really enjoyed it. Hope you do too. That's all I got for now. See you next time.
With